Coming up, what happened when Inter Miami went to see Donald Trump at the White House.
They were going after the entire Middle East, and then we came along. We blew up their party.
Well, it was hard to escape the big story of the week, conflict in the Middle East. Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked. Back again as ever. Tariq Panja from the New York Times, Martyn Ziegler from the Times, myself, Rob Harris from Sky News, and in every direction, war impacting sport events. The Paralympics beginning with protests over Russia and Belarus returning, but a lot of focus on the build-up to the World Cup as the conflict escalates in the Middle East since the US and Israel launched the attacks on Iran while we were at the IFAB meeting last weekend.
Those of who listened to the last pod, obviously, we reacted to that immediately and it happened. But obviously, there have been developments since then. I suppose most significantly, as far as the World Cup's concerned, there was a big meeting of all the 48 competing nations in Atlanta, Georgia, after the weekend. And it wasn't 48, it was 47, because perhaps not surprisingly, who was missing?
Iran were not there. That was obviously in the days after this conflict. But again, it's the second time Iran have had trouble getting into the United States. I think we mentioned it on the pod. The President Mehdi Taj wasn't able to attend the draw in Washington, which you guys attended in December, and that was because of visa issues. So it raises a lot of questions about Iran's participation at the World Cup, and that's one of the things that's kind of been in the news. Do we know any more about this at all?
A lot of the concern will be just what will happen to Iran. How long will the war go on for? The people who are suffering, of course, across the whole Middle East as well. You've got so many countries impacted by the retaliation from Iran, Israel's strikes into Lebanon as well. So that's obviously the concern at the moment. But since we are a sports news podcast, the focus will shift onto what it means for the World Cup. And we've not heard from FIFA in any depth this week. They probably don't really know themselves how things are going to shape up in the coming months. I did speak to the CEO of US Soccer, JT Batson, and he said FIFA President Gianni Infantino shared over the weekend the intention of a safe and secure World Cup where all teams are participating, and we're certainly very supportive of that. That was in response to me asking about Iran, and I said, would you be happy playing them if that's how the tournament progresses? And he told me for this Sky News interview, well, we played Iran a number of times in the World Cup, and just like any other team of the 47 other teams we could play in the World Cup, our goal would be to win. And so we look forward to doing just that. Iran's group games are in
California, 2 games in Los Angeles, which is home to, I think, one of the world's largest, if not the largest, Iranian diaspora in the world, and Seattle.
I think Donald Trump, though, made it clear. He was asked by Politico, does he hope or is he concerned about whether Iran goes to the World Cup? And he says, I don't care if Iran comes to the World Cup. They're running on fumes, I think, or something he said. So I don't think there's going to be any sort of political push to include them. And to be honest, I think if there's no regime change in Iran, even if the conflict is over, can you honestly see them allowing their national team to go to this, the nation they see as a sort of great aggressor? I would be staggered if that happened. I have been proved wrong many, many times, as you're probably going to tell me, but I would be amazed if that happened.
Could it be used politically, the fact they're there?
Yeah, that's the thing I was thinking. We've seen this now. We're going to talk about Russia in a moment, but these big sporting stages are really important for governments and regimes. We've seen over time. Maybe they will. But if you were those players, God, it would be a horrible position to be put in, to be sent there to represent this regime. Obviously, there's no Iranian visas allowed for fans, for example. So most of the people in the stadiums will be anti-regime supporters, probably, right? It's a really awkward place for the football team to find themselves, and I just can't see how they'll be able to have their minds focused on a football tournament in that context.
And it raises issues about things like the Iranian flag. If the team does go and they'd be competing under the regime flag, but then you could have fans with the pre-Islamic Revolution flag, and what would happen then?
Well, it's funny. There's been so many instances. I remember writing a story at the Russia World Cup, going through the security, and I found this book that was given to the people that search fans and people attending games, and had a list of banned flags, and it went to several pages of these flags. So whichever FIFA will have to make a decision on which flag is allowed, which one isn't. And don't forget, at the Qatar World Cup, when Iran were playing, there was a lot of disagreements, including some fighting between their own fans, pro-regime, anti-regime fans, at the World Cup in Doha. So, yeah, all of this is obviously very uncertain, but it's very hard to see a kind of a happy ending with any of this where it comes to the World Cup.
It's a very difficult one for FIFA as well to negotiate. But say Iran doesn't or pulls out or whatever, decides not to go or can't go, whatever. How is a replacement found? Do you know?
Gianni Infantino will choose, and I say that because having looked at the rules for the 2026 World Cup, it says if a team can't play for some reason, force majeure is a word that's been used, or for whatever reason, it seems a lot of latitude for FIFA to decide who would take their place. Now, Iran were the second team from Asia after Japan to qualify for the World Cup in Asian qualifying. Now, there are intercontinental playoffs happening now, and Iran's neighbor Iraq is the next Asian team that didn't qualify, which is in these playoffs, and they beat the United Arab Emirates in a playoff for the playoff, if you want. Now, could it be one of those teams, or who gets to choose? If it's Gianni Infantino, he might choose somebody else.
An all-star team.
Yeah.
The best of the players who haven't qualified. Rule nothing out. The legend.
Rule nothing out.
The modern-day legend.
This isn't another Rob Harris looking into his crystal ball, seeing what the future holds, I hope.
It would have to be a team from Asia that takes their place. You couldn't possibly deny Asia a spot. What a difficult moment this week for Iran's women's national team. They've been playing at the Asia Cup in Australia, and a lot of focus on them, particularly at the start of the first match against South Korea. They didn't sing their national anthem. They were there lining up, completely silent. Fast forward a few days later to Thursday, when they played the host Australia, and they did line up, singing the national anthem and saluting.
Weird, yes. I guess when you're in that situation, you have all sorts of different pressures and expectations, and you're thinking about what your actions are doing is going to affect people back home, I'm sure.
We did hear from one of the players in the press conference ahead of the second game, but certainly not talking politically, but showing the emotions of it all. Suggestions, was there any pressure put on the team? But they are a public face of Iran outside of the country at the moment, and they do continue in the Asia Cup, but they have now lost their first two matches.
Yeah, the questions I suppose people are going to ask, but it'd be a horrible place to put them in. What an invidious situation. And we mentioned that with the men's team, if they go to the World Cup, they have to go back home after this. They don't know what sort of country they're going to return to, what sort of pressures they're under, what their families are under when they go home, or right now. It is a very, very difficult position to put any Iranian athlete in.
And even how they get home. I mean, are they going to even be able to get back to Iran with what's going on?
Yes, so many difficulties there. And you mentioned Donald Trump earlier about him saying he doesn't care if Iran goes to the World Cup. Well, we had this strange situation play out in the White House on Thursday, although we get used to the unusual with Donald Trump, when his only media appearance of the day was when Inter Miami were there as a moment to celebrate them being the 2025 MLS Cup winners. And the latest on Iran, why, you've got Lionel Messi and co there.
We had really no choice. They were going to hit us if we didn't hit them, because they're crazy. And in the long term, the actions we're taking will dramatically increase the stability of the region and oil prices and stock markets and everything else. We set the all-time record in history.
The second time this has happened, an awkward situation involving a football team. Remember, poor old Juventus were pulled into the Oval Office that day. I think I remember Weston McKennie, American midfielder, Giorgio Chiellini, Italian Juventus legend, among the people standing behind Donald Trump. And he was asked kind of slightly ghoulishly now whether they could consider bombing Iran. That was one of the discussions that was taking place at the time, and here we are.
Yeah, he also asked the Juventus players for their view on transgender players, and not surprisingly, the some of the players said that it was a bit weird. I think was how they described that meeting.
You do have to be prepared for anything if you're at an event with Donald Trump, and for one of the Inter Miami co-owners, it was raising the prospect of military action next in Cuba.
Congratulations as well to co-owners Jorge and Jose Mas, who came from Cuba, right? Originally from Cuba? Huh? Your parents came? And you're going to go back, oh, yeah. It's going to be, and you won't need my approval. You just fly back in when I can just see that. It's going to be a great day, right? We're going to celebrate that separately. I just want to wait a couple of weeks. I wanted to wait a couple of weeks, but we'll be together again soon, I suspect, celebrating what's going on in Cuba. They want to make a deal so badly, you have no idea. As well as head coach, who I hear is a phenomenal coach, Javier Mascherano. Where's your coach?
And even when Donald Trump was talking football, did manage to praise Messi's great rival.
It's my distinct privilege to say what no American president has ever had the chance to say before. Welcome to the White House, Lionel Messi. Lionel Messi is, my son said, Dad, you know who's going to be there today? And I said, no, I got a lot of things going on. He said, Messi. I said, really? He's a big fan. He's a big fan of yours. He thinks you're just a great person, and I think you got to meet a little while. So he's a big soccer fan, but he's a tremendous fan of yours, and a gentleman named Ronaldo. We have Cristiano is great. You're great.
Well, we didn't hear Lionel Messi's views on the war. One of the immediate challenges for FIFA is around the intercontinental playoffs, how Iraq can leave the country to go to Mexico. It was in last week's pod. We were also talking about the cartel violence in Mexico, about whether those matches could go ahead there. But certainly from the Iraqi FA, they've been complaining about a lack of support they've had in terms of planning to get out of the country. But it is sport widely impacted. We've heard from the cricket world. England cricketers were in the UAE at the time that the war started, struggling to get out. Also, a lot of the Formula One teams travelling through the Gulf usually to get to the season opening race in Australia. Their plans were disrupted. Obviously, very much on the lesser scale of disruption compared to the wider human suffering.
Yeah, I mean the Formula One teams have got a lot of money. They can afford to take alternative routes that avoid changeovers in the Gulf. But there is within Formula One quite serious concern about the Bahrain and Saudi Arabia Grand Prix, because they're due to in the first half of April, not that far away. And the decision, from what I understand, has been taken that if they have to be cancelled, and I think there's a sort of big fear that they will have to be, they won't. That will just mean a shortened season. They won't try and replace them and have alternative races.
It's just a reminder of how much money in global sports comes from the Gulf. In the amount of disruption to sport. Obviously, it's strategic. The strategic location of the Gulf being at the center of between Asia and Europe and the West is one part, but also the amount of money they've poured into these sports. So you mentioned that's week 4 and week 5 of Formula One. which would be the Grand Prix of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. But also in Bahrain, there's a massive testing facility. And Pirelli, the tyre company, they were supposed to have major practice there, and they had to abort literally as these bombs were falling. And you mentioned other sports, well, tennis events, equestrian, Saudi Arabia, and all the stuff we've talked about them investing in over the years. It really is this kind of weird pressure point for global sports, and we're only going to see that how much can be brought to bear in the weeks and months ahead.
And sport could end up feeling the wider economic repercussions from this war. We've had Qatar's energy minister talking about fears that the conflict could bring down the economies of the world. And how many sports are reliant on funding from the Gulf nations through sponsorships? Just look at Saudi Arabia and all the money it's putting into boxing, football, major events. Qatar, with its vast investments across Formula One, football, tennis, paddle, so many investments around the world. And there are concerns being expressed from Qatar that if this war does go on even for a few weeks, that it could hit things financially around the world. And ultimately, when you've got far bigger priorities, could sport take the hit? We were just talking on the pod the other week, even before this war, about Saudi Arabia scaling back some of its funding to focus finances domestically, and that could hit big projects like Neon that are going to be used at the World Cup in 2034. Suddenly, when the safety of your countries is in jeopardy, sport seems far from anything like a priority to invest in. And on Formula One, we have seen disruption in the past impacting races in the Gulf. Go back to 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings, and they did have to call off the Bahrain Grand Prix.
It's quite difficult, for these governments who put a lot of store by hosting these big events. So I think we've talked like Qatar due to host the finalissima between Spain and Argentina. The European champions against the South American champions, and that's towards the end of March. Now, I think within UEFA that there's a sort of feeling that it's unlikely that's going to go ahead. But I think the Qataris will be absolutely devastated, whatever word you want to use, if they lose that, because they've been building up to this as a really big international match for them.
What this does completely undercut is the image of the Gulf. The reason so many sports go to the UAE, to Qatar, is because it is seen as this safe haven in the world where you don't really even have to think about security. If we think to the World Cup in 2022, the fact it was seen as this completely safe event. Now, these places so many fans saw, particularly in 2022, you've got missiles coming in, drones coming in, and this is from Iran, who have been a very close ally of Qatar up until now, at least.
Yeah, it's very confusing for people living there. Not only Qatar, there was a huge Iranian presence in the United Arab Emirates for the last 30, 40, 50 years as well, with business relationships there as well. And I guess this is the nature of the region. Everyone always said the Middle East is a complicated neighborhood, but those countries we've just mentioned have been relatively unaffected compared to the wider conflicts that have happened in the Middle East. Now they're right in the middle of all of that now. The one thing we didn't talk about is the use of these places as places where footballers or sports people tend to go on holiday for warm weather training and things like this. And I think about this because Manchester United, for example, they have 11 days off now or 12 days off because they're not playing in the FA Cup. Or they won't be playing the FA Cup this weekend. Now, typically, I think last year they may have gone to the Gulf or gone to the Middle East. So there's so many layers to this that aren't immediately visible, and that's another one of those.
You did mention the finalissima. Well, one of the big issues would be fans who've already booked their travel from Spain, from Argentina. But you've got to think, if the game doesn't go ahead, it's because you can't get into the country. So hopefully everyone does get their refunds from their airlines, from the hotels, etc. But some sports event disruption of a different kind this week. We're about a week away from the women's Africa Cup of Nations beginning in Morocco, and just postponed it until the summer. So lack of explanation really why, but thinking of the fans who booked their trips, the media who've got all their plans in place, they won't get any refunds at all. And from the Confederation of African Football, it's really creating a bad image for them, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Rob, what do you mean they haven't really explained? So what did they say?
Well, only we heard from Luxo September, their communications chief, on social media, saying there have been several discussions for weeks. The matter is receiving urgent and high-level attention. And I think back to the Men's Africa Cup of Nations in January, and Patrice Motsepe, the CAF president, was complaining about people from within Africa doing down their own tournaments, questioning their ability to stage these events. And then just weeks later, seemingly with little regard, week or so's notice, just postpone the flagship women's event for the continent.
And didn't he also, Motsepe, didn't he also just like announce without any warning at all that it was going to, the men's AFCON was going to go every 4 years instead of, that came out of the blue as well, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah, well, it annoyed a lot of people, didn't it? A sudden announcement that the AFCON, which has been played every 2 years, and the oldest regional competitions, will now be every 4 years. It's this suddenness of all of this. So this AFCON for women was going to be played, Rob, in Morocco as well, where the men's tournament has just finished, right?
Yes, and they're building up to the 2030 World Cup co-hosting. So do want to show that they do have the ability to be able to stage these events. Well, an event that is just getting underway is the second part of Milan Cortina, the Paralympics. But all this has been overshadowed by, well, conflict on two fronts in Iran and still Russia's war on Ukraine. Now, there's two parts to this. We'll get to Russia and Belarus and their reinstatement in a moment, but we are in the Olympic Truce period still. And very, grimly a few weeks ago, we did actually foresee this Iran war starting on this podcast. We mentioned this perilous period between the Olympics and the Paralympics, Russia annexing Crimea, going into the Donbass in 2014, in 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine being launched by Russia. Do these countries wait until the end of the Olympics? Something we've never heard from. But we did hear from the IOC this week in a statement that's probably attracted more criticism through its lack of any mention of any of the countries involved.
That's right. We did, because in 2022, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the IOC released a pretty strong statement criticizing Russia for its actions over there. It strongly condemns, it said, the breach of the Olympic Truce. In this case, as you said, this period between the Olympics and the Paralympics, we've seen more conflict, more the US and the Israeli attack on Iran. The IOC has not issued a similar condemnation or defense of its Olympic truce. Instead, it took a couple of days, they put a very long statement out about this truce, with the point of it, as far as it's concerned, is to allow the free movement, unencumbered movement, safe passage for athletes to get to these events. But the one thing that struck me in its statement is this. It says the Olympic Truce resolution is an aspirational and non-binding resolution which the UN member states agree on for each edition of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. It's tabled by the host nation of the Games and is adopted by the UN members themselves. And the IOC has no means of enforcing the implementation of the resolution, which is kind of interesting, because when you look at the Russia case, they did use this breach of the Olympic truce as one of the reasons for the ban and suspensions on Russia and Belarus. That said, Russia has breached this thing multiple times by the time they were eventually banned from the Olympics. And just my last point on this, I was talking to someone at the IOC and they were suggesting, look, we're not separate from what's happening in the world. At the time Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a huge amount of outcry. Everyone refused to compete against them. There was a huge risk to the Olympic Games with Russia's presence there. We're not seeing that much in the way of anyone refusing really to be on the same stage or to perform against, in this case, the United States and Israel, are we?
No, and there is that big difference that the reason FIFA did ban Russia is because teams were refusing to play against them, refusing to host their games. And you think who would be refusing to play the US now? Well, it would be perhaps aggrieved neighbours of Iran, but you've got Kuwait, you've got Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, the ones actually fending off missiles and drone attacks now from Iran. So it's a very different dimension. And what we're seeing from the IOC, and we sense this in Milan, and we mentioned it the other week, they're backing away from the politics, even though they have the Olympic Truce, their UN observer status. There was no mention of the Olympic Truce by Kirsty Coventry in her speech at the opening ceremony at the San Siro. That it seems that Kirsty Coventry, despite being a former sports minister herself in the Zimbabwean government, really wants to back away from the politics. So they're not having to deal with these awkward and challenging situations.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Thomas Bach, when in 2022, he actually used his speeches at the opening and closing ceremonies of the game. He said, "Observe your commitment to this Olympic truce," he said to the political authorities, "give peace a chance." So that is completely different to what Kirsty Coventry, the stance she's taken. I think she wants to move away from any sort of politics as much as possible.
And if you look at her speeches, the content of those, they are focused purely on sport. In fact, she's kind of doubled down on that, so that our business is sport, effectively saying, we know all of these things are happening, but I, as the IOC president, I'm not someone who wants to really deal with that.
And the International Paralympic Committee are really taking the lead on bringing Russia and Belarus back because they're at the Paralympics, which are ongoing. We've been hearing from the IPC president, Andrew Parsons, defending their return despite a growing boycott, including no UK government minister going to the opening ceremony. He'd previously told me that they found less evidence that Russia was using sport to promote the war, so that's why the ban didn't need to remain in existence.
Yeah, it's not just the UK politicians from around Europe, but interestingly as well, 7 countries took no part in the opening ceremony, or will take no part in the opening ceremony, depending on when you listen to this pod and when it was released. Ukraine, obviously, the Czech Republic, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland not taking part in any shape or form in the opening ceremony. Some other nations, including Great Britain and Germany, and I think the Netherlands, taking part, but through videos of their athletes rather than in person. But that might be more to do with the logistics. Obviously, Verona, where this opening ceremony is miles away from where the events are taking place.
Quite convenient for the likes of Paralympics GB to be able to say that they just couldn't get any athletes to the opening ceremony rather than announcing a boycott themselves. Poland's broadcaster, TVP, who are showing the games, they said that whenever Russia or Belarusian athletes were to appear at the opening ceremony, that they'd cut away from the feed and instead display messages of solidarity with Ukraine. And they would also skip the national anthems if any athletes from Russia or Belarus win gold.
Going back to the interview that the IPC President Andrew Parsons did with you late last year, Rob, this sort of claim that, previously the ban was brought in because Russia used Paralympic sport to promote their war, and there's less evidence of that now. To me, that just sounds like a sort of feeble excuse for letting them back in again to me. And I think I can see other countries, not in Europe, they're not in favour perhaps of this ongoing ban on Russia, and he's been sort of persuaded on that front.
Well, it's not that he's been persuaded. There was a vote on Russia and Belarus, and the majority of the IPC's members, I think there's more than 200 of them, voted to restore Russia and Belarus. There's not much he can do about it. He's like the head of the organization. He's going to have to defend the position that his members took, or walk away, and he's obviously still there. So he's going to have to defend this. And the point of that was most of the votes, Africa, South America, and Asia, a lot of the members from there said, well, hang on, why are Russia not at the Olympics? We're seeing all of these other issues in the world right now. And that's what they did. And this is a complicated place sports find itself. There's all these horrific conflicts taking place all at once. Don't forget, lots happened since 2022.
And it all becomes very complicated for the athletes involved. Do they choose to speak out? Do they remain silent? How do they get involved in politics? And it's a story I did this week ahead of the World Cup, because I heard from the Players Union in England, the Professional Footballers Association, Maheta Malango, who told me that he'd been hearing from England players that they were getting concerned that they were facing pressure to become political spokespeople. And, he was saying that, they are socially conscious, the players in the England squad. But what some of them have told me, he said, was that they see it's a little unfair that they're told they have to become spokespeople for governments, for governing bodies, when they should be the ones who take the lead. I think they're feeling a bit bruised by what happened in Qatar and so much the tournament being overshadowed for them in the build-up in terms of having to talk out on the political issues. We saw it with Germany, who had that memorable protest at the Qatar World Cup, covering their lips, silence, and later Joshua Kimmich, the Germany captain, expressed regret that they expressed themselves in such a political way, and it took the joy out of the tournament. And what Maheta Malango from the PFA told me is that they'll use their platform when they think it's appropriate, and they're very conscious of what's going on in the world, that they just don't want to be forced to do so. And this isn't about the FA banning any media, blocking any questions at all. I think it's just sending out the message that there might be a reason why they don't want to get involved in every bit of Trump's politics and having to talk about Trump and the like at the World Cup. And I suppose, do they have to answer on every bit of whatever Trump says when they're out in the US in particular?
Now put yourself back into the press conference you mentioned right at the start of the pod with those Iranian women. Now think of the position they've put themselves in based on what Maheta has said to you there. That's degrees of difficult. You can imagine why some of these athletes want to 100% focus on what they're doing on the field of play, because this starts to get extremely complicated. And then layer in social media, and then you're in a whole, difficult place.
I think when they aren't the ones that are being held to account, us as media might ask an opening question in a way that gets a sense whether they want to comment. And if they don't, then you don't really have to challenge them and put them on the spot. Ahead of the World Cup beginning in 2022 in England's group, along with the US and Wales as well, were Iran. And I asked Carlos Queiroz at the time about the protests against the treatment of women in Iran. And he sort of vaguely engaged, but a manager's perhaps very different from a player. They are a more leadership position. You expect to hear from the heads of the governing bodies at that time. And before the Qatar World Cup, we did hear from the FA Chief Executive, Mark Bullingham.
Yeah, Gareth Southgate as well, when he was England manager, he was the sort of go-to for any sort of social issue that happened to be in the headlines at the minute. I think, was he even talking, people showing the St. George's Cross and things like that. Exactly, all that sort of stuff. So I think it's, there was a time, certainly around England football, where that seemed to be the sort of, that was the first question of the press conference. What's your view on the latest social issue? I think that's probably going to be less of a factor in the USA unless something happens, and then obviously something big happens. Everyone's going to get asked about it.
I think for all of us, we get a sense of who we're interviewing or asking questions to in a press conference, the type of responses they might give. So we knew Gareth Southgate would always engage in wider societal issues, and he wanted to be seen as this figure who was in tune with what was going on beyond football. So during the World Cup in 2018 in Russia, it was a time of domestic political strife and turmoil, trying to get the Brexit deal through Parliament. And we would often reflect with him about the fact that this England success reaching the semi-finals there was something to attempt to try and bring such a divided nation together.
Yeah, he definitely, I wouldn't say reveled, but engaged in this issue because he thought about it a lot and saw his platform in that way. But I would maybe disagree with Ziegs there, but I think there will be a lot of questions about politics during the World Cup in the United States. Not necessarily international politics, but the country there is so divided on a number of issues. And when you have a lot of media in one place, we've been to other tournaments, those local issues suddenly become international issues almost because the international media is living in that country for that period of time.
And incidents can happen during the tournament. Politicians can post on social media as well, weighing in on something that's going on across the World Cup, and then it makes it directly relevant to the tournament. If players end up encountering politicians, as we've seen this week with Inter Miami, with Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, we've got Harry Kane, the England captain, perfect person to answer those questions. Thinking back to Volgograd, when he was asked about the significance of what is previously called Stalingrad, and he said, "History is what it is." You can't say any more than that.
I was in that news conference, and it was a bit of an awkward situation, but he's never portrayed himself as being a man of history. I mean, very different if, say, Roy Hodgson had been England manager, he probably could have given a whole long press conference just going into the history.
Well, weirdly enough, he is really a man of history. England's top goal scorer, his caps record. I mean, he is going to be a man of history. So there you go.
Footballing history. Not all media may be asked the most challenging questions. A lot of focus this week on Fabrizio Romano and the post he put out, global humanitarian role of Saudi Arabia, #ad, and a video attached.
Yeah. If you watch this, you'll learn all about the Saudi King Salman's humanitarian fund, and the work they do, clearing landmines, having operations on conjoined twins. Not quite sure why somebody who is sort of renowned for breaking football transfer scoops, 47 million or 43 million followers on Instagram, 27 million on X. Why is he doing this message and being paid clearly handsomely to do it?
It does seem out of place because we don't normally expect from Fabrizio Romano's account to be commenting on societal issues, political matters, social causes, particularly at all. So it really did jump out. But before we get into some of the scrutiny, is it any different for Fabrizio Romano putting this as an advert, promoting a Saudi-funded project from a newspaper, a news website, having an ad for a state-funded entity on there?
It's a very good question, that. But again, it talks about whether he is, what is he, a journalist or an influencer? There's a lot bigger questions on what modern media looks like now, because this is effectively, I'm sure he's got a few people working for him now with all the tweets he has to send out, the 27 millions and the 47 millions Ziggs mentioned there. But there's also this point of the quid pro quo element of it, whether true or imagined. This is a man who trades in information about player trades, particularly also including from Saudi Arabia, and information about Saudi interests. In Saudi Arabia, the top teams are owned by the state. Effectively, if you want to look at it, the same state that's doing this charity work, if you want. So the question is how independent the journalism is from that type of thing. And I think that probably is a legitimate question. It'd be nice to perhaps talk to him at length about how all of this works.
And that's at the very least the perception as well, and perhaps different from an advert in a news publication. It's him delivering the message himself in the video rather than an advert being separated from the journalists on a website, on a TV station, somewhere around the world that would take that sort of advert, or indeed in a newspaper. There has been a community note now attached to it in X. That's when people submit context they believe should be posted underneath the post, and somehow it gets approved. And it does talk about Saudi Arabia paying for its propaganda to overlook its long-standing bad reputation over human rights, and it does post various links from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. But have you managed to put any of this to him, Martyn?
Yeah. I had a text conversation he sent me a voice note, I think pointing out that this fund was actually sort of recognised by UNICEF. So that, that he was, I think, trying to make the point there wasn't anything sort of underhand about it. But and he also said he's, when he's looking to get statements from his lawyers, I think in response to what's been said on the community note. But you're right, it has caused a lot of sort of consternation about that this is happening. Somebody said to me, it's almost like the ultimate sport washing. You use a football journalist to provide a sort of semi-political message.
But if you're to look at the account for KS Relief, everyone would get on board with the work it's doing, surely, largely. It's talking about helping to separate conjoined twins, successfully clearing mines in Yemen, providing food in Gaza.
No, of course. But the question is, why are you using a football influencer to spread that message, which is the sort of strange one. And I spoke to Nick McGeehan from the Fair Square organisation about this, and he just said this is like a well-resourced communication strategy to create positive narratives about Saudi Arabia, obviously the 2034 World Cup hosts, and that even if like a small proportion of his social media audience thinks that his views on the progress in Saudi Arabia are as reliable as transfer scoops and the Saudis get the result they want. There's a wider thing here about sort of, if you want to be seen as a journalist and a reporter, even if you're an influencer, should you really be advertising like this? I mean, I think Fabrizio also did an ad for FIFA for the Club World Cup. And we've seen, others have taken similar steps. So once you cross the line, I think it becomes quite difficult.
And if you want to keep listening to a podcast that has no advertising, for now, hit subscribe and listen to us if you're new to the pod. Well, that about brings an end to this week's episode of Sport Unlocked. How often are we talking about global conflicts?
Too often.
Well, as Gianni Infantino did say to me for an interview briefly at IFAB, I hope so much the World Cup will be a moment of peace. I hope we can contribute to a little bit. The world really needs it. A message of peace.
Yep. Well, I'm sure no one's going to disagree with that.
From the man who is on the board of peace. We'll see how successful they are about bringing this war to an end. Well, as ever, you can hit subscribe, message us at Sport Unlocked on all the social platforms. But for now, thank you for listening. Goodbye.